Scientific linguistics, a never-ending history. The particular science I'm going to examine, linguistics, is both a physical and social science, hard when dealing with sounds, morphology and syntax, soft when dealing with semes and semantics, and social when dealing with communication in social and cultural contexts. Like all other sciences, linguistics is never finished, fully achieved, or completed at any time of its history, including today and tomorrow. It is, like all sciences, a non-finished attempt to understand and explain the functioning of the ever-changing perceptible objective substance it tries to explore. The myth of universal grammar. In linguistics, we have a long history of grammarians or linguists who have declared their cogitations on one particular language or a group of languages were the final state of knowledge on this or these languages. In this field of science, the only possible discussions come as a confrontation between several schools that are reciprocally excluding one another. The first linguists of note to use mathematics, hence what is considered as undebatable science, but is it really? Was Zelish Harris. He used statistics to determine the end of a word, not in writing but in language in general, hence in oral speech. He had observed that the phoneme that comes after the last phoneme of a word is widely open as for choice, whereas within a word the choice is a lot more limited. This indicates the cuts between words, hence the units of a particular discourse. The units can be defined either as semantic or syntactic. Zelish Harris was working at first on Semitic languages, and he used mathematics to generalize what he discovered. In his own retrospective survey, published as the background of transformational and meta-language analysis in 2002, original text by Harris in 1990, he said it was possible to describe the entire program from the outset. Nevertheless, working out its consequences and demonstrating its result required many years of painstaking work with tests in many languages. This idea of linguistics being an entire program, meaning it has a beginning and an end, and that the end is the end, hence perfect knowledge, not to say the truth, is the perfect vanity of some rationalistic structuralists who constantly keep in mind the fact they are targeting this absolute truth, this final knowledge, terminating the search itself, and that we will only have to check the results in new languages. It does not mean Zelish Harris or Noam Chomsky were of that type, but it is the general idea that comes out of the publication of these linguists, particularly their followers. Zelish Harris insists on the fact the semantic dimension of language is essential because language is communication, and this semantic content is connected directly to the form of the utterances or discourse. At the same time, he knows the recipient of the discourse will add some meaning from his or her own mental awareness of what the discourse is dealing with. That's a major difference with Noam Chomsky, who totally reduces the discourses he analyzes to what the utterer formally, meaning by the form the utterance carries, projected into it, which is limited in understanding by the tremendously dangerous objective that he, Chomsky, deals with the standard language of the average person in an average discursive situation. Harris knew there is nothing average in communication, and it always depends on the utterer and the utteree. Both add to the plain structure of the utterance a whole paradigmatic flow of information that actually determines the meaning for both the utterer and the utteree. This is a lot more interesting than it may look. The concept of uttery, far from being admitted by all linguists as fundamental in any kind of communication. Think of Gustave Guillaume, for example, who speaks of effet de sens, which means effective meaning produced by the real form of the utterance as produced by the utterer. If you want to introduce the utteree, you have to understand that the meaning for him will be what meaning he captured in the effective meaning intended by the utterer, hybridized with what he or she, the utteree, is projecting into this form. The form of the utterance contains an effective meaning from the utterer that is captured partially or not by the utteree, who anyway projects his or her own meaning into the form that is open to such intrusion added contribution. Zelish Harris was a research director of Noam Chomsky, who worked priority in English and generalized what he found out to all languages. I use the verb find out because for these structuralist linguists, everything they presented was a discovery. Chomsky targeted as abstract model of language seen as one human ability more than numerous particular virtual material tools to communicate. They both created the field of what was called at first transformational grammar and was extended into universal grammar later on by Noam Chomsky himself, which Harris did not do when more studies from more linguists considered more languages. There is absolutely no phylogenetic approach in this linguistics. They reject, at least totally neglect, any diachronic approach, any historical approach. A language for them is a fully stable set of rules and lexical items, even at times seen as unchangeable. If they change something, it's because they made a mistake or they did not consider all the cases they should have considered. It is not the method or the program that is wrong, it is the linguist who is mistaken. Noam Chomsky is totally unable to capture the simple observable fact that languages, any languages, change all the time. But this emphasis on linguistic competence for a whole community, defined as homogeneously speaking one language, makes him insensitive to linguistic creativity, poetry, literature, even simple political discourses, the discourse of politicians, religious and ritualistic discourses, etc. And what about real living communicational oral language? He worked on and with a normative vision of each language he considered when he himself got out of standard English, or his followers considered. And that came from the very start. Noam Chomsky's Syntactic Structures 1957 introduced a bias in his approach by choosing to build the grammar of a language from and only from grammatical sentences actually uttered and utterable in the said language. The term grammatical, of course, is difficult, and it is opposed to ungrammatical, but also nonsensical. To be accepted, a sentence has to be both grammatical and sensical, meaningful. The structure comes first and the meaning comes second. As he says in syntactic structures, the notion grammatical cannot be identified with meaningful or significant in any semantic sense. Sentences 1 and 2 below are equally nonsensical, but any speaker of English will recognize that only the former is grammatical. The first sentence is, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. The second sentence is, furiously sleep ideas green colorless. Such examples, Chomsky goes on, suggest that any search for a semantically based definition of grammaticalness will be futile. The use of the future will be futile in the rejection of any semantic approach is exactly what I mean when calling such approaches the absolute reference to a norm. Chomsky here establishes a norm that rejects any alternative to what he may say or think, and generative semantics is not yet in the picture in 1957. The condemnation of future attempts to consider things differently is just rejected before it has come into existence. He aborts the alternative theory even before it has been conceived, impregnated into some kind of fetal life. We have the same closure of any discussion possible, any alternative imaginable, with Chomsky's declaration once and for all that language is a result of a black box in the brain of any human being, and that black box is innate and it precisely contains universal grammar. Hence, universal grammar is genetic. After such a ukase, there is no possible discussion and elaboration on the development of language in children, on the acquisition of a foreign language, on bilingual and multilingual children, on the impact of any, each, and all languages on the way a speaker may think or see the world. It did not consider two essential researchers in the field who essentially worked between 1925 and 1965. Vygotsky, who died in 1934, would of course oppose such an approach. Both the black box and the purely pragmatic observation about the acquisition of linguistic competence in one or more languages by children. But even Piaget, who lived long after 1945, would find it difficult to accept such approaches. Conceptualization is a key notion in this approach of the phylogeny of language in the child and the acquisition of a language first or second. Check older people over 60 or 65 who have just gotten their first computer, tablet or smartphone, and how they learn how to use these machines and the concept they need to do so. This structuralist linguist of universal grammar understands language as if it were a machine, which it is not. Even if it is a complex set of tools that people, once they have acquired or developed these linguistic tools, can use freely to express what they want to express, what they have the impulse to express, etc. But when I have rejected the mechanical way of thinking language as an innate universal grammar, it is obvious I have to suggest an alternative, and this alternative has to be phylogenetic. It develops and thus has a genesis, which doesn't mean it is genetic, from its inner dynamic and within the outside circumstances of the child environment. Of course, the newborn is not a tabula rasa. It reaches life with all it has auditorily accumulated from the 24th week of its fetal life onward. In its memory, all the vocalic and consonantal clusters of sounds that have had any repetitive presence in the environment of his mother. The first thing it is going to do as soon as it is born is that it will recognize these clusters in real life, hence attach them to some items, objects, persons around it. Before birth, it memorized repetitive clusters, and after birth, it attaches these clusters to references. Hence, the brain-machine code its brain had used before birth to remember the clusters after discriminating them from one another, which was possible because they were repetitive, becomes language. That is the beginning of the construction of the language the child, because now she is a child, will acquire and develop. And beyond this first collecting of referentially meaningful clusters, the child starts to mentally walk on the road to conceptualization. What is innate? Because something is innate. The ability to discriminate sensorial items in a continuous flow of sensory impacts. The not yet born is just like any other animal. Sensations, discriminations, brain-machine code for memorization. But the human newborn starts building her mind, and in her mind, a language that gives to her simple animal discrimination power and memory a completely different dimension. Language which develops from scratch, would you say? Not really. But if you state a universal grammar is innate, there is no development anymore, only a process of activation. There is no real free thought, only a more or less open adaptation to some outside stimulus. And that's exactly what the rationalistic structuralists in linguistics have produced at first in the USA, and then they exported it to the whole world as part of the American cultural domination thanks to Hollywood, the Marshall Plan, and chewing gum. Since 1945, we have been trying to free ourselves from this leash and reopen the scientific field. There is no truth. There are only points of view. And a point of view has any value if it enables more point of view to develop. The pragmatic technological way of thinking that American scientists too often develop is the end of science, the end of progress. It states the full and total truth, and for them it is the final truth, and it is the technical satisfaction of human needs. And today we are living through a crisis that makes this pragmatic technological vision absurd. Because the answer to the COVID-19 pandemic is not technological. Even with as many vaccines we could invent, it is a whole change in our human way of life. Emerging from this American pragmatic technological vision, the next stage is Ray Kurzweil's hyper-technological answer, the singularity, when artificial intelligent machines will be more intelligent than human beings. beings, when the human body will be controlled by thousands of nanobots in our veins, organs, including the brain and muscles, to make us able to live in a time when machines are more intelligent than human beings. And these nanorobotic human beings will have better behave, otherwise the machines that control all these nanobots will cut them off, implying your death in a few minutes at best, and with no pangs of conscience from the machines. But there is more to say about this universal grammar, and an alternative that opened the future research instead of closing it with some theoretical, pragmatically oriented conception declared at once universal and final. It is, in a way, a man-made apocalypse that leaves us, the slaves of the intelligent machines. An elite of technicians and engineers are inventing to turn us into nanorobots, into flesh and bone androids, into what is altogether, and in the end, a figment in the mind of some technical inventors made real into a dystopic accumulation of closing arguments, meaning arguments that close any further research. But is there something universal? And I will say yes, there is, the human communicational situation.